Sometimes the coldest night becomes the place where destiny quietly begins. Snow drifted through the towering pines like pale feathers, carried by the winter wind, covering every branch and stone in a silent blanket of white. The northern forest stretched for miles beneath a grey sky, untouched except for the faint tracks of a lone traveler, whose strength was nearly gone. Clara Bennett stumbled forward with trembling legs. Her worn boots sank several inches into the fresh snow with every step. Her faded brown cloak, once meant to keep out the cold, was soaked through and dusted with frost. Each breath escaped her lips as a fragile cloud, before disappearing into the icy air. She no longer knew how many hours she had been walking. Time had become meaningless after the gates of her pack closed behind her forever. No one had chased after her. No one had asked her to stay. The pack elder had looked away rather than meet her eyes. "Leave before nightfall," he had ordered. "If winter takes you, the pack will not be responsible." No one protested. Not a single wolf stepped forward. Clara searched the crowd one last time. Faces she had grown up beside. Faces she had once cooked for. Faces she had secretly helped through sickness and hunger. Every one of them looked away. Only then did she understand. They were not sending her away. They were quietly leaving her to die. She had lowered her head, gathered the small cloth bag that held the last few things she owned, and walked into the wilderness without looking back. The memories followed anyway. Harsh words echoed louder than the winter wind. Disappointed faces lingered longer than the falling snow. She tightened her hands around the edge of her cloak, as if holding it together could somehow keep the broken pieces of her heart from slipping away. She whispered a quiet prayer to the moon goddess, not asking for miracles or revenge, only hoping that somewhere beyond the endless snow there might still exist a place where she belonged. The forest answered only with silence. Far away, almost too distant to recognize, the faint sound of wolves echoed across the mountains. Clara lifted her head for a brief moment. The howls carried strength and confidence unlike anything she had ever known. They belonged to powerful wolves, traveling together, protected by numbers and purpose. She smiled sadly before lowering her eyes once more. Whatever destination they traveled toward, it was not meant for someone like her. The wind suddenly grew stronger, sending icy flakes swirling across the narrow trail until even her own footprints began disappearing behind her. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and forced one final step forward, then another. Her vision gradually darkened around the edges. The tall trees seemed to sway gently as exhaustion overtook her. She reached another massive oak, whose roots stretched across the frozen ground like ancient arms. With the last of her strength, she lowered herself beside its broad trunk, hoping only to rest for a few moments before continuing. The cold quickly seeped through her clothing. Snowflakes settled across her hair and shoulders without melting. She tried to open her eyes again, but found them growing heavier with every passing second. Her breathing slowed into quiet, uneven whispers. Just before everything faded into darkness, she thought she heard the distant rhythm of approaching hoofbeats, mixed with the deep call of a great wolf somewhere beyond the trees. Then the forest became still once more, as the first rider of the Northern Kingdom entered the silent winter woods, completely unaware that only a few yards ahead, hidden beneath drifting snow, lay the young Omega whose life was about to change forever. Darkness did not disappear all at once. It retreated slowly, giving way to the comforting crackle of a fireplace and the faint scent of cedarwood drifting through warm air. Clara Bennett frowned slightly before opening her eyes. Above her stretched a high wooden ceiling, crossed by heavy oak beams. Thick wool blankets rested over her shoulders, and soft morning light poured through tall windows, framed by deep blue curtains. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, wondering if she had somehow awakened inside a dream. The last thing she remembered was snow falling through silent trees, and the unbearable cold wrapping around her like endless winter. Yet here, warmth surrounded every corner of the room. A fire burned steadily inside a carved stone hearth. Fresh flowers rested beside the window, despite the season outside. Someone had carefully placed a steaming cup of herbal tea on a nearby table. Confusion slowly replaced exhaustion. Clara carefully pushed herself upright, wincing as her tired muscles protested. Before she could gather her thoughts, the door opened quietly. A middle-aged woman entered, carrying another tray of warm tea and fresh bread. She wore the modest uniform of a castle attendant, her silver hair gathered neatly beneath a linen cap. The moment she noticed Clara awake, relief spread across her gentle face. "You are finally awake," she said warmly. "We were beginning to worry you might sleep through another day." Clara blinked in surprise. "Another day?" The woman nodded. "You have been resting for nearly 2 full days." Clara's heart skipped. "Where am I?" The attendant smiled kindly while setting the tray beside the bed. "You are safe inside Blackwood Castle." Clara froze. The name alone was enough to make countless stories rush through her memory. Blackwood Castle was home to the royal family of the Northern Territories, a place ordinary villagers only spoke about in whispers. She looked around the elegant room once more before shaking her head. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake." The woman poured warm tea into a small cup before offering it to her. "His Majesty ordered that you receive the best care available." Clara stared at her in disbelief. "The Alpha King?" "Yes." The woman smiled again. "He found you buried beneath fresh snow. At first, the royal scouts believed you were already gone. One of them even suggested leaving before the storm trapped everyone. But His Majesty dismounted immediately. He knelt beside you with his bare hands and cleared the snow away himself. Your heartbeat was so faint that no one believed you could survive. He ordered the patrol to light every emergency lantern they carried. Then he wrapped you inside his own winter cloak and carried you all the way back to Blackwood Castle. No one had ever seen the Alpha King ignore military protocol for a stranger before. Clara lowered her gaze toward the steaming tea. She had spent years believing powerful wolves barely noticed people like her. Yet the most respected alpha in the kingdom had stopped for a stranger lying forgotten beneath the snow. "Why?" she whispered, almost to herself. The attendant looked thoughtfully toward the window, where gentle snow continued falling beyond the glass. "His Majesty never ignores someone in need," she answered quietly. "That is simply who he is." Before Clara could ask another question, distant footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Several castle servants hurried past the room, speaking in respectful whispers. One voice drifted through the partially open doorway. "The king has returned from the eastern watchtower." Clara instinctively looked toward the entrance. She did not know why her heart suddenly beat a little faster. She had never met the Alpha King before. She knew only the frightening legends that traveled from village to village. But somehow, those stories no longer seemed to match the man who had rescued a forgotten Omega from the frozen wilderness and quietly given her a second chance to open her eyes beneath a warm roof instead of an endless winter sky. While Clara Bennett slowly regained her strength inside the quiet warmth of Blackwood Castle, the man who had rescued her found no such peace. Long before sunrise painted the snow-covered mountains with pale gold, Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood was already standing alone atop the eastern watchtower. A cold wind tugged gently at the hem of his long black coat as he looked across the endless forests stretching toward the northern horizon. Below him, the castle slowly awakened. Royal guards changed shifts with disciplined precision. Stable hands prepared horses for patrol. Smoke curled from dozens of stone chimneys into the crisp winter air. Everything moved according to routine. Everything except the restless thoughts occupying the king's mind. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. His closest advisor, Marcus Ellery, approached with respectful calm, carrying several rolled maps beneath one arm. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, bowing his head slightly. "The southern trade route has been cleared after the snowfall. The merchants will arrive by tomorrow afternoon." Nathaniel acknowledged the report with a quiet nod, though his attention remained fixed on the distant tree line. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. "May I ask about the young Omega?" The king's silver eyes shifted at last. "She is awake." "Yes. Lady Miriam says she has begun eating again." Nathaniel released a slow breath that disappeared into the cold morning air. "That is good." Marcus studied his longtime friend carefully. "You seem relieved." Nathaniel allowed himself the faintest smile. "Should I not be?" Most rulers would have continued their patrol without stopping. Nathaniel looked back toward the endless forest below. Most rulers did not hear someone struggling to breathe beneath the snow. Silence settled between them for several moments. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "You carried her back yourself." Nathaniel answered without looking away. "She weighed almost nothing." The words lingered quietly in the freezing air. Marcus understood there was more behind them than simple observation. Whoever Clara Bennett had been before entering Blackwood Castle, life had not been kind to her. Nathaniel had noticed it immediately. Even unconscious, she had clung tightly to the edge of her worn cloak, as though expecting someone to take away the last thing she possessed. He had seen frightened children hold onto blankets the same way after losing their families. It was not weakness. It was survival. "Will you meet her?" Marcus finally asked. Nathaniel remained silent for another moment before nodding once. "When she is ready." He did not wish to frighten her with titles or expectations. She had awakened in an unfamiliar castle, surrounded by strangers. She deserved time to discover safety before facing the man every village described through legends and rumors. Far below, sunlight finally reached the castle courtyard, casting long golden shadows across the snow. Nathaniel rested both hands upon the cold stone railing. For reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself wondering whether the young Omega had smiled before the hardships of life had taught her to lower her eyes. It was an unusually personal thought, one he quietly dismissed before turning toward the stairway leading back into the castle. Yet somewhere deep within his heart, a feeling he had almost forgotten stirred gently awake, not born from duty or responsibility, but from simple hope that the frightened stranger resting beneath his roof might someday believe she no longer had to face the world alone. Over the next several days, Blackwood Castle slowly became less frightening to Clara Bennett. The towering stone walls no longer felt like barriers keeping her inside, but quiet guardians sheltering her from the endless winter beyond. Every morning she awoke to the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting through the corridors, followed by the cheerful greetings of the castle attendants, who never once treated her with suspicion or contempt. Their kindness felt unfamiliar, almost unbelievable. Clara found herself thanking them for even the smallest gestures, earning warm smiles that gradually eased the guarded expression she had carried for years. Before long, the castle staff began looking forward to seeing the gentle Omega walking through the halls each morning with her soft smile and calm voice. One snowy afternoon, Clara wandered into the royal greenhouse, hidden beneath a tall glass ceiling that captured the pale winter sunlight. Unlike the frozen world outside, the room overflowed with green vines, blooming herbs, and colorful flowers carefully protected from the cold. She knelt beside several drooping plants, whose leaves had begun to wilt despite the careful work of the royal gardeners. Without thinking, she gently loosened the soil around their roots, trimmed away damaged stems, and whispered encouraging words as she watered each plant. By the following morning, the once fading flowers stood noticeably brighter. The elderly head gardener scratched his beard in amazement. "I have tended this greenhouse for 30 years, he said with a laugh. "I have never seen lavender recover overnight during the middle of winter." Clara smiled shyly. Perhaps they only needed someone to be patient with them. The old gardener chuckled warmly. Or perhaps they recognized kindness when they found it. Word of the flourishing greenhouse quietly spread through the castle. Soon, stable hands asked Clara to visit an aging carriage horse that had refused to eat for days. She spent nearly an hour sitting beside the gentle animal, stroking its neck and speaking softly until it finally accepted fresh hay from her hands. The stable master could hardly believe his eyes. In another corner of the castle, frightened kitchen cats that usually avoided strangers began following Clara from room to room, weaving happily around her boots whenever she passed. From an upper balcony overlooking the greenhouse, he watched the old gardener smiling more than he had in months. Crossing the courtyard one afternoon, Nathaniel noticed several children of castle workers gathered around Clara, while she patiently taught them how to braid dried wildflowers into simple winter wreaths. Their laughter echoed across the snow-covered stones, filling quiet corners of the castle that had long forgotten such light-hearted joy. Marcus eventually joined the king beside the balcony railing and glanced toward the cheerful gathering below. "Interesting," he said quietly. Nathaniel folded his arms. "What is?" Marcus smiled knowingly. "You rescued one young woman from the forest." He gestured toward the courtyard. Yet somehow, she has managed to rescue the spirit of your entire castle." Nathaniel remained silent as he watched Clara laugh gently when one of the smallest children accidentally dropped an armful of flowers into the snow. She knelt beside the little girl, helping gather every blossom without the slightest trace of impatience. In that simple moment, Nathaniel realized something remarkable. Clara Bennett had never once tried to impress anyone. She had simply continued being herself. Somehow, that quiet sincerity was changing every life it touched, including his own. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Blackwood Castle, and with each passing day, something else began to change as quietly as the seasons themselves. Clara Bennett no longer startled whenever footsteps echoed through the castle corridors. She greeted the servants by name, shared warm conversations with the gardeners, and often spent the early mornings walking through the greenhouse before the rest of the castle awoke. It was during one of those peaceful mornings that Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood finally chose to stop watching from a distance. Clara was carefully tying young climbing vines to wooden supports when she noticed someone standing near the entrance. She immediately rose and lowered her head respectfully. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Nathaniel offered a gentle nod instead of the formal distance she expected. "I hope I am not interrupting." Clara smiled softly. "Not at all." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The greenhouse was filled with birdsong drifting in through slightly opened windows, while sunlight shimmered across rows of blooming winter flowers. Nathaniel looked around with quiet admiration. "The gardeners tell me these flowers have never looked healthier." Clara glanced toward the blossoms with a modest smile. "I only try to understand what they need." Nathaniel's eyes rested on her for a thoughtful moment. "You seem to do that with everyone." Clara lowered her gaze, slightly embarrassed by the compliment. "People are not very different from gardens," she replied gently. "Sometimes they only need patience before they begin growing again." The simple words lingered between them. Nathaniel found himself smiling, not because the answer was clever, but because it was sincere. As they reached a stone bench surrounded by flowering ivy, Nathaniel paused. "May I ask you something?" Clara nodded. "Of course." He looked toward the glass ceiling, where melting snow slid quietly from the roof. "When I found you in the forest, why were you alone?" The question carried no judgment, only quiet concern. Clara remained silent for several seconds. She folded her hands together before answering. "My pack believed I was more burden than blessing." She spoke calmly, without bitterness. "After a while, I began believing it too." Nathaniel's expression softened. "They were wrong." Clara looked up, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Nathaniel continued. "I have watched this castle for many years. I have seen skilled warriors, brilliant advisors, and fearless leaders. Yet in only a few weeks, you have given hope to people who expected nothing from life except another ordinary day." Clara felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. No one had ever spoken about her that way before. She looked away, trying to hide the emotion gathering behind her smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel sat beside her on the stone bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. Neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet that followed. The silence itself had become comfortable. For the first time in many years, Nathaniel realized he was not thinking about reports, borders, or responsibilities. He was simply enjoying the peaceful company of another person. Clara noticed it as well. The intimidating ruler described in countless stories seemed to disappear whenever they spoke alone. In his place sat a man carrying invisible burdens with remarkable grace. As sunlight poured through the greenhouse windows, warming the flowers around them, Clara quietly understood that the Alpha King had not only rescued her from the frozen forest. Without either of them realizing it, they were slowly rescuing each other from the loneliness they had each carried for far too long. Spring finally reached the northern valleys, carrying with it the first gentle warmth the kingdom had felt in months. Snow still rested upon the distant mountain peaks, but the castle gardens had begun to awaken beneath clear blue skies. Clara Bennett often found herself walking the stone paths during the quiet hours after sunrise, admiring tiny green shoots pushing bravely through the earth. To her, every new blossom felt like proof that even the longest winter eventually surrendered to hope. One bright morning, a royal messenger arrived unexpectedly at the castle gates, carrying the crest of Clara's former pack. News traveled quickly through the halls. By noon, several representatives from her old home stood respectfully inside the audience chamber, requesting permission to speak with her. Clara's hands tightened slightly around the edge of her sleeve when Lady Miriam quietly delivered the message. Memories she believed had finally faded returned all at once. Nathaniel noticed the uncertainty in her eyes before either of them entered the great hall. "You do not have to meet them if you are not ready," he said gently. Clara looked toward the tall windows, where sunlight poured across the polished stone floor. After a thoughtful silence, she nodded. "No. I believe I should hear what they came to say." Together they entered the audience chamber. Nathaniel remained beside the royal throne, not as a shield, but as a quiet source of reassurance. Across the room stood Clara's former pack elder, accompanied by 2 council members. They bowed deeply before the Alpha King before turning toward Clara. The elderly wolf cleared his throat. "Miss Bennet, we have come to ask you to return home." Clara listened quietly without interrupting. "Your presence beside the Alpha King has brought unwanted attention to our territory." The elder hesitated. "Neighboring packs believe our Omega has earned the king's favor. Trade agreements have begun changing. Political alliances are shifting. If you return, our pack may recover everything we have lost." Clara stared at him. Not once had he asked whether she was happy. Clara searched each familiar face, hoping to recognize the warmth they now described. Instead, she found only careful diplomacy and uneasy calculation. For the first time, she understood the difference between being wanted and being valued. Nathaniel remained silent throughout the exchange. He offered no command, no expectation, and no pressure. Finally, he stepped forward only once, his voice calm and steady. "Clara, your future belongs to you." The elder stepped forward. "She still belongs to our pack." Before Clara could answer, Nathaniel's voice became colder than winter itself. "No." The single word silenced the entire hall. Royal guards instinctively straightened. "The woman standing beneath my roof belongs to no one except herself. If she chooses to leave, no one will stop her. If she chooses to stay, no one will force her away." His silver eyes swept across the delegation. "Not even an entire pack. Whatever choice you make, today will be respected." The room fell completely silent. Those simple words touched Clara more deeply than any promise ever could. For years, other people had decided where she belonged, what she was worth, and how she should live. No one had ever simply placed her future in her own hands. Slowly, she turned away from the delegation and looked toward Nathaniel. Gratitude, trust, and quiet affection filled her gentle smile. Without hesitation, she crossed the room until she stood beside him. Then, with complete confidence, she reached for his hand. Nathaniel looked at her with surprised warmth as her fingers rested lightly in his. Clara lifted her eyes to meet his. "I am grateful for where I came from," she said softly. "But this is where I learned that kindness can be returned instead of forgotten. This is where I found peace. If you will allow it, this is where I choose to stay." Several servants quietly smiled. The gardeners lowered their heads. Even the royal guards standing beside the throne exchanged relieved glances. Without realizing it, Blackwood Castle had already begun thinking of Clara as family. Nathaniel's smile carried more happiness than any royal celebration could have given him. He closed his hand gently around hers, not as a king claiming a subject, but as one lonely heart accepting another. Outside the castle windows, spring sunlight bathed the gardens in golden light, while birds sang among newly blooming flowers. The harsh winter that had once brought Clara to Blackwood Castle had long disappeared, leaving behind something far greater than survival. It had quietly become the beginning of a home, built not by fate alone, but by compassion freely given, trust patiently earned, and 2 hearts that discovered love only after first learning how to heal. One crisp spring morning, Marcus entered Nathaniel's council chamber, carrying several letters gathered from neighboring packs. "Your Majesty," he said thoughtfully, placing the correspondence upon the long oak table, "it appears Miss Bennet's kindness has become a subject of conversation throughout the region. Nathaniel glanced over the neatly sealed letters before lifting one. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Interesting, he murmured. She never told anyone these stories. Marcus folded his hands behind his back. People rarely speak about the good they do. Others remember it for them. Later that afternoon, Clara wandered into the castle library, searching for a book on medicinal herbs. She found Nathaniel standing beside a tall window overlooking the valley below, reading one of the letters in quiet reflection. He looked up as she approached. "These arrived today," he said, offering her the small collection. Clara hesitated before accepting them. As she slowly read each page, her eyes widened with surprise. Many of the names were familiar. They belonged to ordinary people she barely remembered helping years earlier. None of the letters praised extraordinary deeds. Instead, they thanked her for simple moments of compassion that had never seemed important at the time. One elderly widow wrote that Clara had repaired her broken garden fence without being asked. A shepherd thanked her for staying beside his frightened daughter during a fierce snowstorm. Another family simply wrote, "You reminded us that kindness still existed when we had almost forgotten." Clara lowered the final letter, her eyes shimmering with quiet emotion. "I did not know anyone remembered." Nathaniel stepped beside her, his voice gentle. "Kindness leaves footprints that often remain long after the person who made them has walked away." Clara looked out across the rolling hills, glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "I always believed those small moments disappeared." "They never did," Nathaniel answered. "You simply could not see where they continued." She turned toward him with a grateful smile. "Then perhaps I was never as alone as I believed." Nathaniel met her eyes, warmth replacing the loneliness that had once defined his quiet expression. "No," he said softly. "You never were." Outside the library windows, fresh spring blossoms swayed gently beneath a clear blue sky, while birds circled above the castle towers. Clara realized that the life she had thought ended beneath the snow had quietly become something much larger than she could have imagined. She had not only found a home. She had discovered that every act of compassion she had ever offered the world had been planting seeds all along, and now, surrounded by people who truly saw her worth, those long-forgotten seeds were finally beginning to bloom. Summer arrived gently across the northern territories, covering the hills surrounding Blackwood Castle with fields of wildflowers that stretched toward the distant mountains. The kingdom seemed lighter than it had in many years, and its people quietly noticed the change. Travelers no longer spoke only of the Alpha King's strength or the castle's towering walls. They also spoke of the gentle Omega whose kindness had become as familiar as the morning sun. Clara Bennett accepted every compliment with the same humble smile, never believing she had done anything extraordinary. To her, every act of compassion still felt like the simplest choice a person could make. One peaceful afternoon, Nathaniel Blackwood invited Clara to accompany him beyond the castle walls for the annual summer gathering held in a nearby village. It was the first public celebration he had attended without surrounding himself in formal ceremony. Together they walked through streets decorated with ribbons, fresh flowers, and handcrafted lanterns, while families greeted the king with respectful bows and warm smiles. Children ran freely across the village square, musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies, and merchants proudly displayed baskets of fruit gathered from the first harvest of the season. Clara quietly admired the happiness surrounding them. As they passed through the marketplace, several villagers unexpectedly recognized her from years before. An elderly woman stepped forward with tears in her eyes and gently embraced Clara. "You stayed beside my husband when he became ill during the winter festival," she said softly. "You never asked for anything in return." Before Clara could answer, a young father approached, carrying a little girl whose bright smile immediately lit up the square. "She still remembers the story you told her when she was afraid of storms," he said. One by one, more familiar faces appeared. None spoke of grand sacrifices or remarkable miracles. Instead, they remembered small moments that had quietly changed difficult days into hopeful ones. Nathaniel watched every conversation with growing admiration. He had ruled thousands of people for years, yet he realized something profound while observing Clara. Authority could earn respect, but only genuine kindness earned lasting affection. As the afternoon continued, the village elder invited Nathaniel to address the gathering. The Alpha King stood beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, while the entire village listened. Instead of speaking about laws, trade, or military victories, he looked toward Clara before beginning. A kingdom becomes truly strong when its people care for one another without expecting reward, he said calmly. Many believe greatness is measured through power. I have learned that greatness often appears quietly, through patience, compassion, and the courage to help when no one is watching. Every eye turned toward Clara, who immediately lowered her head with quiet embarrassment. Nathaniel smiled warmly before continuing. The woman standing beside me has reminded not only this castle, but also its king, that hope grows wherever kindness is planted. A gentle breeze carried his words across the silent crowd. Clara looked up, surprised to find smiles surrounding her instead of judgment. No one saw weakness in her gentle heart. They saw strength expressed differently than they had ever imagined. As the celebration came to an end, Nathaniel and Clara walked together along a peaceful hillside overlooking the valley below. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, while birds drifted across the warm evening air. They paused beneath a flowering tree, where petals floated softly around them. Nathaniel turned toward Clara with quiet sincerity. "When I found you beneath the snow," he said, "I believed I was saving one life." He smiled gently. "I did not realize you would help an entire kingdom remember what truly matters." Clara's eyes shimmered with gratitude as she quietly reached for his hand once again, and beneath the fading summer light, both of them understood that the future before them had been built not upon destiny alone, but upon countless ordinary choices filled with extraordinary kindness. Autumn returned to the Northern Territories exactly 1 year after Clara Bennet had first been found beneath the snow. The forest surrounding Blackwood Castle shimmered with gold, crimson, and amber leaves, while a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine across the hills. Standing on the highest balcony of the castle, Clara looked over the valley where her life had changed forever. It was difficult to believe that the frightened young Omega who had once wandered alone through a frozen forest was the same woman who now greeted every sunrise with quiet confidence. She had not become stronger because the world had suddenly become kinder. She had become stronger because someone had shown her that kindness could exist even after heartbreak. Nathaniel Blackwood stepped quietly onto the balcony beside her, carrying 2 warm cups of herbal tea prepared from the very greenhouse Clara had helped restore months earlier. He handed one to her with an easy smile that no longer needed formal words. Their silence had become one of comfort rather than uncertainty. Together they watched the first rays of morning sunlight spread across the kingdom below. "It looks different," Clara whispered. Nathaniel glanced toward her. "The kingdom?" She nodded. "No. We do." Nathaniel smiled softly because he understood exactly what she meant. There had been a time when both of them believed loneliness was simply another duty life expected them to carry. Now they stood side by side, no longer defined by the pain that had shaped their pasts, but by the hope they had chosen afterward. A knock sounded gently behind them. Marcus entered with a respectful bow before offering a small wooden box carved with the crest of Blackwood Castle. "Your Majesty," he said warmly, "the council asked me to deliver this." Nathaniel accepted the box before turning toward Clara. "It belongs to both of us now." Curious, Clara lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of carefully folded letters, tied together with a blue ribbon. They had come from villages across the Northern Territories, each written by people whose lives had been touched by simple acts of compassion. Some thanked the king for leading with wisdom. Others thanked Clara for reminding them that every person deserved dignity, no matter how forgotten they once felt. One letter, written in the careful handwriting of a young child, simply read, "When I grow up, I want to be brave enough to be kind." Clara quietly wiped away a tear before smiling through it. Nathaniel gently closed the box and rested one hand over hers. "That may be the greatest legacy either of us could ever leave." Nathaniel stopped beside the ancient oak overlooking the valley and turned toward Clara with calm sincerity. "The day I found you beneath the snow," he said quietly, "I believed I was saving a stranger." His silver eyes reflected the golden light of the setting sun. "What I truly found was the person who reminded me how to live beyond duty." Clara gently squeezed his hand. "And you reminded me that home is not the place where you are born. Home is where someone chooses to keep your heart safe. They stood together as hundreds of golden leaves drifted through the crisp autumn air, their quiet dance carried by the gentle wind across the kingdom below. The seasons would continue to change, winters would eventually return, and new challenges would one day arrive, but neither of them feared the future anymore. They had already discovered the greatest truth life could offer. Sometimes love does not begin with destiny, power, or grand promises. Sometimes it begins with one compassionate choice, made in the silence of a forgotten forest, and from that single act of kindness, an entirely new life quietly grows.